I'm in I suppose, a rare position in that I work all over the world, which I'm lucky to do. And so I've been asked to talk about what I see, what I see as a sort of an overview of the world of what I call regenerative agroecological practices, not just agricultural practices, because a lot of these producers and farms that we're going to look at in my presentation will be more ecological agriculture than just agriculture. So that's where I'm going to start. Just before we start, though, this is where I'm from, this other planet called Australia, which, as we now know, has some of the first agricultural practices ever happening on this planet that go back tens of thousands of years. This continent, like every continent, was occupied by indigenous peoples, just like Ukraine was. A very proud history there that goes back a long way. And our continent had over 300, well, has over 350 different nations and languages, and then dialects within that. I live right down the bottom corner, southeastern corner, which is a climate that's probably not that dissimilar in ways to the south of Ukraine, probably more like Georgia, Turkey, Spain, and the Mediterranean, but certainly not an unusual climate for a lot of you. Get this to work. When we talk about regenerative agriculture or agroecology, the first thing that I always think of is the Rodale Institute and Bob Rodale, who was the first person to come up with the term regenerative organic agriculture. And I think it's always important when we look at the lineage of things to go right back to the start, those first thoughts that people had around these sort of things. And here's the 7 tendencies, which is a very nice way of putting it, towards regeneration in not just agriculture, but also in communities and personal spirit. And this is the original typing back when people used typewriters in 1983. So that the concepts of pluralism, of protection, of purity, of permanence, of peace, potential, and progress, the 7 Ps, you might say. The 6 core principles of regenerative agriculture are, I think, fairly universally understood and appreciated, that people start to look at understanding their context, whether it's themselves or of where they are and their whole operation, to minimise soil disturbance as much as possible, to maximise crop diversity, and I would add to that to maximise biodiversity, to keep the soil covered is always something that people are looking to do, whether that's with living plants or the residues of plants, to maintain living roots all year round. That's a really big part, because so much of agriculture only has living roots for part of the year. It's a really important part of this practice or set of practices, pathways to do just that. And then the other big piece is to integrate livestock. And as many of you will know, there's a lot of work against having livestock in agricultural ecosystems for their methane outputs in particular. And that's something that we will look at today, and I'm sure plenty of other people will throughout this conference. I've looked at, and I've had a bit of more of a look at this today, and I won't go through the whole thing, but I've been trying to mind map this, what are all of the sectors, as I'm going to call them, of regenerative agriculture or agroecology. And I've come down to a few, and I'm coming up with a few more, which I'll look at in the presentation. But starting at the top, there's agroforestry. So this concept of where we're integrating woody plant agriculture or forestry systems into more traditional agricultural systems. Horticulture, whether that be vineyards, orchards, vegetable production, etc. Cereals and grain, legume and oilseed production, which is such a feature of Ukrainian production systems. Livestock, systems, which in this case, in the case of regenerative agricultural systems, are largely outdoor, not indoor. Planning, in terms of what planning systems we're using, what certification systems, and what training systems as well. I could add to that this other support systems in terms of soil testing systems that are out there, and also podcasts and other YouTube channels and all of that sort of dissemination that we're getting more and more of, the extension work that's out there. When we look at planning, the basis to, well, the only real holistic planning approach that has been developed for regenerative agriculture actually goes back to the 1950s. And this was the keyline, or the keyline plan has been called by the co-founder of permaculture design, David Holmgren, as the first functional broad-scale agricultural landscape planning tool, integrated planning tool that was ever developed. And it still is, outside of the one that we've developed. And our agrarians platform is, should be no secret, is that it's been based largely on the Yeoman's Keyline plan. This is a CGI diagram that one of a Ukrainian gentleman and us worked with back in 2015 to explain how Keyline works as a planning framework and how it can be applied to this landscape. But it's a planning framework that can be applied to any landscape anywhere in the world where agriculture is practiced. So I'll let people have a look at this another time, but it's when you've got the moments. But this little video just goes through the various planning layers and the ways that a property, in this case, might well be developed to integrate trees, roads, buildings, how to do soil development, how to do irrigation, and so on. With the question, could this plan ever happen? And indeed, yes, it did. This was a property just outside of the Australian city of Sydney that was developed by PA Yeomans. And I'm just the young man that helped us was Miron Barabak, who helped us. He was a young Ukrainian compositor and CGI artist that helped us with that program. Our own Regrarians platform is, as I mentioned, based off the Keyline scale of relative permanence. It's got 10 layers, which I'll go through now. The first one is climate, which has to do with the climate of the people that are working, but also the climate of the enterprise and cultures and so on. Also, then with the next layer is the geography layer and how we bring all of that together in terms of landforms and mapping and etc. The water layer, which is what we call is the first infrastructure layer. So how can we take control of the water cycle and especially do that on a farm itself? So how can a farm be in better control of its own water resources, starting with the raindrop, but then also extending to the types of decentralized water infrastructure that someone might build into an agricultural landscape. Access layer, which is where we're looking at roads and all of that, and all of the access features that go into a landscape. The ecosystems layer, which is where we're looking at all of the different biota or biotic systems, whether that's the plants, all of the kingdoms of nature, plant integration, animal integration, fungi, bacteria, and algae. How are all of these kingdoms of nature being integrated into a system? Building layer, all of the portable buildings, which have become such a strong feature of the low cost of entry into regenerative agriculture, which is a strong feature of its enterprise base, but then also extending to other buildings, the stationary buildings that we use, and then also that concept of being able to do more processing of agricultural products on farm before before they leave. The fencing layer, which is very much built around these days electric fencing, but also virtual fencing and standard fencing systems. And then the way that all of those are all brought together into a farm planning whole. The soils layer, which is largely a management layer where we're looking at planning, grazing and planning cropping systems. And then with that, what supports our intelligence about that in terms of planning is agronomy, geotechnical investigation, and the determination of what treatments we may use over time. So then from Yeoman's, or the keyline scale of permanence, 8 factors, we added on another 2 factors or layers, as we call them, because we're planners, and that was the economy layer and lastly, the energy layer, where we're looking at these layers as being very important additions to what P.A. Yeoman's, the keyline founder, came up with in 1958. So now I'm going to switch over to a short overview of the world of regenerative agricultural or agroecological practices. It is purposely short because I want to allow people time to have discussion today, but also because it's a really big field and we could look at a heck of a lot. So I've tried to just break it down into those sectors that I mentioned earlier in the mind map. So the first one I'm going to look at is agroforestry, and from the perspective of timber products, I think we've been a big fan of Pro Silver, which is a European organisation that's been out there for I think about 20 or 30 years now, and their principles, their timber forestry principles of trying to maintain and elevate ecosystem function, increase protection of systems, increase production from systems, and increase the cultural output of forest systems. And I think that they're very sound and universal principles. Other people in the world that we look up to and have worked with, Wood for Good, one of my first partners at Regrarians 25 years ago now, Ben Boxall, he is a co-founder of that company, and they go around our part of the world and install mostly timber-based agroforestry systems into farms, and then they have a whole wood production model where they enter into agreements with the landholder that they're working with, so they bring investment funds or not, but at the very least they provide a solid cash flow to those businesses or to those enterprises which have put those plantations in. And the plantations are largely put onto landscapes which have been classed as having limited value for agriculture. Agricultural landscapes in terms of their capabilities are vast, and a lot of landscapes have got to the point where they've been exhausted or they weren't really appropriate in their land use in the first place. So there's a good strong case for reintroducing forest systems for different production. Rowan Reid, a friend and colleague, he's developed what's called the Master Tree Growers program here in Australia, and also wrote the great book called Heartwood, the art and science of growing trees for conservation and profit. So the photos on the right-hand side are from his wonderful property, which is a 70-hectare agroforestry farm with a strong focus on timber production. Non-timber products, there's probably a bit more work in this space. And when I say non-timber, it's the focus. A lot of the species that are grown in agroforestry systems also are dual purpose. So, walnuts and chestnuts, for example, can both be used primarily for food production, but also ultimately for timber production. But I've been an advisor of Propagate since they started about 5 years ago, I think now. All of them have done our courses, and we've been advising them ever since. And they've gone on to develop a really strong investment model. So they work predominantly in the United States and work to use investors' funds or join investors with landholders who want their landscapes to do more than just grow grass, perennial tree crop systems. So that's what they do, and they do that for a very wide variety of different species, everything from chestnuts down to blueberries and other sorts of installations. Often they're integrated. So you can see there's some trees and then there's some stripes there in between. Well, that'll be some chestnuts, perhaps with some blueberries or other berry species integrated in. Then they help people establish the markets and do the management and installation and design and so on. That led them to develop the over-yield package, which I use and that I'm an ambassador for. And it's a really great, a very unique software that they've got funding to develop, and they've got a really bright young team. It's a very easy to use piece of software, and it's one where you can very easily design these agroforestry systems, and then as soon as you make the design, then it creates the economic output, how much it's going to cost to put in, how many trees are involved, how much carbon's sequestered, what inputs are you going to need, and so on. It's a very well-developed piece of software. The Savannah Institute are members of the Agrarians Workplace, and they are planner members, which mean that for us, that's where they have access to our main planning program, the REX, our 14-week online farm planning program. So we've got a relationship with a lot of people in that we sort of are consultants to consultants, which has been a position we've held for a long time in this industry. And they also do an amazing job of doing education, and some of these outputs that they've got here, where they've got sort of standard designs for different integrations of agroforestry, many of which you will have seen before or seen parts thereof. But a lot of landscape, and I know this to be the case in Ukraine, that a lot of landscapes are being cleared continually, and the role of trees in those landscapes is not quite as it was before. And that's something that we see, particularly in landscapes which are more humid. There's a strong role for reintegrating trees, or putting trees into parts of the landscape where they may not be right now. So that we can increase the diversity of income, but also increase the biodiversity of a landscape, and which is vital and of vital importance when it comes to outcomes from regenerative agriculture. Horticulture is an interesting one, and I think that when I look at the world as far as regenerative agriculture is concerned, horticulturalists tend to have a different outlook to people who grow crops or who grow livestock as their main game. And I think the reason for that is because when you plant horticultural woody plants, you can't go anywhere. You're in there for the long run. You've got to tend these organisms very differently to how you tend animals and how you tend crops. If you grow annual crops, you prepare the ground, the crop grows, and that's it. I'm simplifying, of course, there's more to it. But people who produce vineyards, who produce apple trees or walnuts or whatever other woody plant horticultural crops tend to have a bit of a longer view and a longer aspect to how they're working with their landscapes. So that's how I've observed. And they have often been some of the easier people that we've seen to work with in terms of transitioning from what they're doing now to what they can do in the future. And my friend and student Francesc Font, who I'll mention a few times in this presentation, is doing a really good job both on his own property in Catalonia, just north of Barcelona, right through to now overseas as well. And Francesc has got a great project which I've worked on as well at Son Felipe on Menorca, and using rollers and biodiverse plantings in here so that we don't need to use any of the quite strange concoctions, quite lots of hormones used and herbicides and pesticides and all sorts of different biocides are used in horticulture, which are quite different to what they are in other conventional agricultural systems. It's so often the case. Even just last week, I was talking to a project that I work with in Georgia and just east of Tbilisi, and they have 2,000 hectares of almonds, and they said they went cold turkey from chemicals last year. And last year they had black mold over all of their almonds last year. This year they went to cover crops, they've maintained cover just in 1 year, and they've got all of those symptoms of poor ecological health have immediately disappeared, which I was very surprised by. Usually things take a bit of time in transition, but in this case it has not. So, life begets life, as the Bible says. And so when we do start to invite life back into these landscapes, it tends to create all of these positive feedback loops. Horticulture and vegetables is a really interesting field as well. My friends Jody Roebuck and his wife Tanya Mercer in New Zealand, or Aotearoa, at Roebuck Farm, which is the sort of aerial photo there. Curtis Stone, who's working his little tractor there in a suburban yard in Canada, in Kelowna in Alberta in Canada. And then over in Quebec, Jean-Martin Fortier, who these three people, three farms and farmers are probably at the forefront of what's known as biointensive organic agriculture right now, horticulture right now. They all do a lot of training, they all do a lot of extension, they all do a lot of record keeping. People who do this sort of operation are very intensive people, and they're generally very intense people. They do, and you can see all of the farms are very productive. They produce all year round in quite diverse and hard climates, particularly in Canada, and generate really high quality product and generate significant amounts of income. So I know Jody's Roebuck farm is on 1,000 square meters. It's got 1,000 square meters of production area right now, and it generates now, after 14 years, it's now got to the point where it generates 250,000 New Zealand dollars per year, which is about 180,000 US dollars per year off 1,000 square meters, producing vegetables directly to the market. In the livestock space, this is where I would say, when we look at regenerative agriculture and where it really started and where it really lifted off in the first place, I think it was within the livestock sector, particularly when it came to cattle, sheep and goat production. That was largely through the agency of a man called Alan Savory, who's still with us, fortunately. And if you're about, I think next month, Alan will be having a debate at Oxford University with the Guardian writer, George Monbiot, about George Monbiot doesn't see a role for livestock in agricultural ecosystems. Obviously, Alan Savory does, so they're going to be having a debate, which I think will be really fascinating. In any case, there's a range of different players, providers, education and consulting providers in this space, and they all come largely to the same position of trying to maintain a relatively high number of livestock in one place at one time, but then keep them moving so that they can encourage higher leaf production, higher productivity, more humus, fat roots, but then once they've gone, provide the absolute amount of rest that allows all of the plants to recover not only their foliage, but also their root systems before any animals come back. That's a really strong tenet of what we might call regenerative grazing practice. Probably the best integrated livestock farm in the world is Polyface Farm. run by friends of ours, the Salatin family. Joel Salatin is probably the most famous farmer in the world at the moment and has been for some time. He's a prolific writer, but he's also a prolific farmer. The farm is quite an incredible place. It's only got about 50 hectares of pastoral area. The rest of it is forest, but the volume of people that are working there's about 30 people working there at any given time, with what's so-called in this space stacked enterprises. So and it's a leader-follower system. So the cows go first, they're followed by egg-laying chickens, who are followed by turkeys, which are followed by pigs, which are followed by meat chickens, and so on. So you've got this whole, choreographed sequence of livestock operations, all on what is and what was a relatively low capability grazing landscape when they first came upon it. It's a very dynamic place, and our family made a film about it, which we released in 2015, and it was called Polyfaces. So if you get a chance to watch that, you can certainly check it out. In terms of the poultry space, this is one that a lot of people have got into because the profits from poultry production on landscapes are quite high. It's one of those things when you produce a chicken, for example, whether it's the eggs from chickens or the meat from chickens, and you do it on landscapes in these ways, there's a really, the consumer can very quickly take, you can blind test the consumer for the difference in flavour. That's quite amazing. And the profitability of running these systems is, as I said, quite high, and it's why you don't need a lot of land to run these animals. You don't need a lot of capital outlay to build the infrastructure that's needed. And their feed, while chickens obviously eat a lot of feed, the feed that they need is in these systems is dramatically reduced over what it is in the indoor systems that we've become more accustomed to. And they work really, as I mentioned before, with the polyface example, you've got this leader-follower system where the nutrient that you may be importing as feed to these chickens then gets turned into fertilizer, which then grows more grass for your other forms of livestock, or can be used for growing crops and so on. Later today, you'll be hearing from our friend Rick Clark, who I don't know if he's in that tractor, but that red machine is a variation on a Rodale roller crimper machine. And this is a field of cropping, which I see having a really strong possibility in Ukraine in the future. Called organic no-till. Now, a lot of the cropping systems that you have in Ukraine are not that dissimilar to parts of cropping systems in the United States, and that was one of the reasons why I sought to invite Rick to join us on this conference, because of his fairly recent transition to organic no-till on quite a significant acreage. His family run about 7,000 acres, so around about 4,000 hectares of land in Indiana in the United States. So one of the great things about this whole set of practices is how much water infiltration change that makes, but also how much extra carbon is sequestered, as you can see through this sequence from another famous farmer in this space, Gabe Brown, who's gone from 1.7% organic carbon 30 years ago, or in this sequence, in 20 years, he's gone from 1.7% up to 11.1%, which is obviously very significant change. And it's a lot of a download of atmospheric carbon into his soils. Another system and this is the one that I have done a lot of myself and on various properties and our own, is what we call here in Australia as no-kill cropping. It's probably the lowest input cropping system that there is. No chemical use whatsoever. Very low cost, direct drilling systems, dry sowing, integrated in with livestock operations and are highly productive when you look at the cost of inputs versus the yields that are possible, and a very low risk farming system, particularly useful in drier parts of Ukraine, I would say. In terms of testing and analysis, Dr. Rick Haney is probably the person outside of Dr. Elaine Ingham on the biological side of things. But Dr. Rick Haney has probably done the best job or the biggest change in terms of soil testing is concerned. There's a number of labs. I'm not aware of any in Europe. There's a number of labs in the US and here in Australia that manage these tests. The big thing about Rick's testing is that it actually, the testing reagents that he uses are similar to, or are some of the compounds that plants themselves exude out of their root system as they're accessing different nutrients in the soil through their exudates. So it's also a branch of what's called green chemistry. The typical soil labs that many of us would be using or are familiar with use some pretty nasty compounds and have a pretty nasty waste stream, and that's been something that so-called green chemistry has tried to overcome by using not only compounds which plants actually use to access and make soluble minerals, but also to reduce the ultimate waste stream impact. In terms of training, there's a lot of different training providers globally, in Europe, in the Americas, Oceania, and elsewhere. These are some of those that I've had something to do with over the journey, and that I would have you consider wherever you're listening or tuning into. A lot of, I think, in terms of Europe, well, you'll hear over this conference from our friend Juan Fran Lopez and his company, Living Agriculture, especially as he pertains to biofertilizers and chromatography and that sort of thing. But there's a whole host of really good people doing some really good work out there. In terms of podcasts, which a lot of people are into these days, this is just a small selection of some of those that are out there. They're all at different levels and they all have a different angle, but there's some really good material out there. One of my favourites is John Kemp's Regenerative Agriculture podcast. It has it's more technical. It's one of those podcasts that, well, he is more into cropping systems and so all of that sort of thing. But if you're into agroforestry, well, then Dimitri and the team there are really great with that, or Oliver's talking at regenerative skills and a wide range of different things. The Thriving Farmer podcast in the US has more to do with vegetable production. Charlie Arnott with livestock systems, and my friend and colleague Byron Joel with his octarine tree, a really diverse and perhaps more philosophical approach to regenerative agriculture and agroecology. In terms of certification systems, there's a few that are sort of emerging and they've happened fairly quickly. Regenerative Organic Certified is an output of the Rodale Institute, who are the originators of regenerative organic agriculture as a term, as we started with. Land to Market is an output of the Savory Institute. And then we've got these other ones which are emerging over time and so on.
У мене таке запитання. Хочу сказати, що на нашій кафедрі ми дуже багато, власне, працюємо в такому ж напрямку, який ви нам показали і доповіли. І дуже цікаві є моменти. Єдине, що у нас є справді досить велика кліматична різниця між нами, між Австралією і Україною. Скажіть, будь ласка, як ви бачите оце, значить, свій досвід перенести на Україну з рослинним асортиментом, з деревами, адже, наприклад, їстівний каштан в Україні не всюди буде рости, скажімо так. У мене таке запитання, як ви взаємодію асортименту рослинного між російським і українським асортиментом, адже ґрунтові кліматичні умови суттєво різняться між українськими і австралійськими. Як ви бачите цю взаємодію і допомогу нам, щоб зрозуміти цю діяльність? Наприклад, ви говорите про їстівний каштан, який не всюди в Україні росте, він настільки в деяких регіонах добре себе почуває, а якраз у наших зруйнованих регіонах він там дуже погано себе почуває. Дякую.
Darren, the question was, what do you think about connection between Ukrainian and Australian plants? Because not all of them are suitable for Ukrainian conditions.
Most of the plans that I've shown you are actually not from Australia. I think a very small sample of the photographs and examples I gave to you today are from Australia. Australia has a peculiar climate in that it's very unreliable, and that's one of the reasons why farm planning systems such as keyline and permaculture, regrarians, etc. have developed in Australia, because it's a difficult place to practice agriculture. And our agriculture is largely European agriculture. So, and I think wherever you go, the first thing that you have to do is to look at the landscape and its capabilities. Some of that will already be obvious in an agricultural landscape. So then it's a matter of choosing the practices that you need to apply to change from what you're doing now to what you want to do in the future. So starting with yourself, I think, what do I want to achieve out of this life? What do I want to achieve on this landscape? What will my market accept? And what will the landscape I'm working with actually allow me to do? You've got to start somewhere, and that's so I don't think it matters where you are as to you've got to go through those processes and find some friends who you can, and some professional help that's to help you go through the transition. Thank you.
I will start in English and then I will translate in
Thank you.
My name is Max. I'm from Poltava, and I'm in my first steps in permaculture, but still I'm about situation in Australia. I know that Australia was the model of permaculture, and I want to know, does permaculture farms win in competition between or with conventional farms? Do you have the attention to growth of permaculture farms? This is the first question. And the second, does farmers, organic farmers in Australia rely on subsidies from government or something else? Because I know in Europe, people are rely on governmental subsidies for organic farmers. Thank you.
I'll start with the second question first. Oh, you're going to repeat first. I'll let you do
translation
that.
In Ukrainian. Моє перше питання було, чи, мене звати Максим, я з Полтави, роблю перші кроки в пермакультурі, скажімо так. Мені цікаво, оскільки Австралія була, коли чи є тенденції на збільшення кількості пермакультурних ферм, чи виграють вони в конкурентній боротьбі з звичайними фермами? Це перше питання. І друге питання було, чи є якісь субсидії для сталих ферм, як це, наприклад, є в Європі, де людям за стале сільське господарство доплачують? Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'll answer the second question first. Australia, in the OECD, Australia has the second least amount of agricultural subsidies behind New Zealand. It's interesting when you look at the OECD. I did a study some years ago where I used the CIA World Fact Book of all places, but the CIA, in spite of their bad name, they actually keep very good records on different countries. So it's often a good place to go and look at things. But I looked at the average age of farmers the relative level of subsidies and the agricultural subsidies and the proportion of agriculture as a proportion of GDP. And New Zealand has the least agricultural subsidies in the OECD. It has the youngest farmers, and it also has the highest proportion, or agriculture is the highest proportion of GDP of any of the OECD countries, which was an interesting combination of facts. And Australia wasn't too far behind, although New Zealand is agriculturally is a much more productive landscape than Australia. I know, having many European clients, that up to 50% of that farm's income actually comes from the EU. So it's a substantial boost, I suppose, but it's also, it puts that, it's a welfare, you might say, that makes those farm businesses very unstable, because were economic conditions to change, which they will, then the removal of those subsidies would be diabolical. It would be terminal for many of those operations to remain. So there's that. The question around permaculture in Australia, it's got permaculture design has been here since 1978 when it was started. It's probably its strongest period was in the 1990s and early 2000s. And where permaculture, I think, has got to now is that it's largely a lifestyle project. So people who live on suburban landscapes or small homestead landscapes, they're the people who use permaculture. Not many people use it in what I would call commercial agricultural scale landscapes. That's where regenerative agricultural practices have, and keyline, etc., because they were originally developed for integrated land use on commercial scale landscapes and commercial agricultural landscapes, they've continued to be more prominent. But that said, permaculture has been very influential to regenerative agriculture and so on. So that's where it is. And I see here, does Australia have specific legislation governing regenerative agriculture practices? I know that in Ukraine it is not possible to change the purpose of land. That is, if they are intended for agriculture, then you can't grow forest there. There's a limitation for agroforestry. Yeah, we don't have those sorts of regulations here. I know I am familiar with the kind of regulations that you're talking about, and that's part of what these conferences are about. They're about us creating a dialogue with policymakers so that they can come to the table. I mean, that's part of the whole thing. We have to, come together and start to understand why decisions and why policies exist. And then when we do that, we can say, well, how can we actually work to change those policies so that agricultural landscapes and agriculture can be not only more productive, but more resilient, and particularly more climate resilient, which is something that's important for everyone.
So the question is, if we involve the regenerative agriculture principles on our land, but our neighbor doesn't not do this, what is the minimum distance recommended for this neighborhood? Yeah,
that's a very hard one. I know I'm a very good friend of mine who I work closely with. He has a 1,500 hectare property, and he has planted 300,000 trees over the last 30 years. He's basically everything that you should do, he has done. and yet he's finding it very difficult because all around him, everyone is spraying, and it's making it very difficult for him on his landscape. So I think it's and he's got shelter belts and all of those sorts of things which are interrupting the movement of sprays onto his farm, but still you can't stop what goes into the air, unfortunately. You can't stop what goes into the water, and that's one of the things that drive people like me. We're very passionate about the pollution of our landscapes, and not only our landscapes, but the air above our landscapes. So is there a distance? No. We live on a planet, it's got an atmosphere, it's got a climate which circulates materials. I mean, every whale, every organism's got plastic in it now. I mean, it's a very, very sad story. So if your neighbour is someone who uses all of the chemistry of modern agriculture, and you choose not to, it like I said, I don't think it really matters. You just have to practice what we want to practice, because we know that there will be greater resilience, but understand still that there will be challenges to your systems as a result of the assault that their chemistry is placing upon your system. So yeah, I'm sorry I don't have a good answer for that one, but that's just the reality of where we are.
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you.
So the next question from Marina Kaluzhna. So first of all, thank you for the interesting talk. And the question is, what's the area we are talking about when we talk about regenerative agriculture? There is a specific feature in Ukraine. A lot of lands is cultivated not in the framework of small farms, but in agricultural holdings. What are the areas of regenerative agriculture in Australia?
In Australia, Australia has the largest area of regenerative agriculture in the world. It's around about, I couldn't give you the area in hectares, but I think it's around about 11% of the agricultural lands in Australia could be classed as regenerative agriculture. So it's significant, particularly in the grazing sector, in the livestock, in the cattle and sheep grazing sector. I should mention that there's some industry reports which are out there as well, which perhaps when we have this all come together, we can, in the dialogues that come, we can refer to some of those industry reports.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Можна, доброго дня. Чепрук Анна, я з Хмельниччини. Я маю невеличке фермерське господарство, свою землю, в мене корови, які живуть в напівприродних умовах. І насправді на моїй землі було б дуже цікаво запровадити щось подібне. Але так як зараз мій чоловік в ЗСУ, я фактично на господарстві сама, я не можу це осягнути ні фізично, ніяк. Мені було б цікаво дізнатися, з чого взагалі можна почати, і чи є такі організації, які були б зацікавлені в співпраці і створенні чогось подібного у нас на Хмельниччині. Дякую.
So the question is, there is a land and there are cows, and Anna want to start such farming, and what you recommended, what to start, what we should how to start.
So it's a very small property. So I would think it's a difficult question to answer without having more context, but the biggest thing that I would look at is trying to have a more rotational grazing strategy or management, so that you used what's called planned grazing. So you plan the grazing so that the animals eat they have a high level of utilization, for one. So they graze at a reasonably high density. And two, that the animals don't come back to that area until the grass has completely recovered. And that happens in the growing season. And then, ideally in the non-growing season, that the animals are able to have a stock, what we call a stockpile. When we look at a landscape which is 15 hectares for something like a cow, a cow eats 9 to 15 kilos of dry matter every day. And that can mean anywhere between 20 and 50 square meters of area every day per animal. So it's an artificially small area for livestock, for cattle to work on. And we ideally want to start with a plan so that we can have it so that the landscape is not overgrazed and that there's always sufficient food available to those animals. It's a bit of a difficult question without me understanding more about you, your enterprise, your objectives, your landscape, what breeds of animals you are having, whether they're beef or whether they're meat or whether they're dairy, whether you've got animals inside for some time, what your climate is. So I think it's probably a little unrealistic for me to give you a full range of answers right now, but I would start with looking at holistic planned grazing. Bogdan is someone who is also looking at that, so perhaps you can have a conversation with him about that.
For me, it was impressive, the property of 1,500 hectares, or like 1,300 trees. So my question is how to person can achieve such kind of property? Where can I find investments for that? So it's just interesting because 15 hectares, it's like a small amount of land, but for big amounts, you have to find money somewhere. So do you have some kind of common projects where people just bring their money for the common projects or something? I don't know, just where to the best approach for finding money for property and starting a farm?
Well, a lot of properties start inherited for a start. So some of the properties, I don't know which ones necessarily you're referring to, but they are inherited. So there's that. And unfortunately, as probably the case in a former Soviet country as Ukraine is, inherited land of any scale is probably not available to people. And that's why a lot of larger landscapes in Ukraine, which are owned or operated by large companies, particularly European companies. But outside of that, look, there's land access is a significant issue all around the world. The one thing, a lot of people talk in our country and other countries about housing availability and housing affordability. Most people don't even think or contemplate that there's actually a similar crisis in agricultural land access and agricultural land affordability. The differential between the income that is available from agriculture and the value of agricultural land is increasing. So that's well understood. So it's very difficult for people whose parents haven't given them or they haven't inherited land to gain, not only gain access to larger parcels of land, but also to generate the to get the capital to be able to build up. So I think there's in different parts of the world. I know in the United States, there's different credit systems which are financing young farmers to get into regenerative agriculture. Most of those people, though, are going to be leasing land, so they'll be renting land. That's something that happens a lot in Australia. It happens a lot in the United States, and in a few other parts of the world, especially where there's inherited lands. I don't know the situation well enough, or pretty well. I don't know the situation at all in Ukraine to advise. I think if I was there, when I do come, I'll get a better sense of what the opportunities are. And that's, again, part of what we're trying to do with this conference. This is the first of a rolling conversation that we will be having to better understand what is coming. So, yes. Yeah, exactly. So the intention of this conference is to gather issues. But yeah, I don't have the answer to that question for you right now, but I know in other countries and here, there are some finance, there is some finance available for purchasing land, but also for investing into its change of operation. Just one final point on that is that one thing that is very important regardless is that people like yourselves start to work in the industry. So working for farmers who are practicing these practices, etc. Until such time as you get a track record, no one is going to give you money. That's a given. Yeah.
Okay, there is a carbon credits program in Australia, and the question was, is your project and other projects like taking part in this program or no?
Yes and no. Very few. The reason why it's very few is because the carbon credit system in Australia is regulated by the government, and they have made it very, very difficult. The requirements are very, very high. And so the average farmer, how it works here is that if you are going to engage in carbon credits, then you have to work with a manager, someone who is some company which will manage the whole carbon carbon farming program for you and the payments. And of course, those companies take their percentage, their commission, and if you don't have a lot of land, then it's just not worth going through with that. So we have a lot of farmers who are very successful, who we work with here in Australia and overseas, but I'll speak to the ones here in Australia at least, and they don't, even though they have very good operations and they sequester a lot of carbon, it's not worth because of the cost of the commissions to the carbon farming agents or companies, or management companies, it's not worth them doing engaging in those arrangements, unfortunately. So most of the carbon farming arrangements in this country are on very large cattle stations, especially cattle stations or cattle ranches that have a lot of woody vegetation on them as well, as part of the overall mix. But the average small to medium farm, they don't do carbon farming, don't have carbon farming arrangements. There's talk about a concept called aggregation, which is where farmers who are too small to do carbon farming, to have carbon farming arrangements by themselves, aggregate with other farmers. So they might come, So farmers who've got 100 hectares or less, or even up to 1,000 hectares or more, it's not economic for them to do an arrangement. But if they come together with 20 or 30 other farmers in an aggregation, then they can pool their landscapes, and then it starts to become more feasible. But again, no one's the people are talking about that. I'm not aware of anyone who's actually doing it, unfortunately. Yeah.
The question is, how do you see the step-by-step of restoration the destroyed agricultural lands of Ukraine?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Karen. Whoa, that's a big question. I mean, we need to, well, first of all, we need to understand what the pollution is, and what the level of destruction, what sort of soils we're working with. If they're grazing soils, if they're soils that are growing agricultural crops like wheat and barley or corn or other soya, etc. So there's that part. I think there's going to be, or there would be, a strong role for the use of different biological agents. And this is something I would like to hear from someone like Juan Fran Lopez, who will be talking at this conference, I think today or maybe tomorrow. And the role that there will be for biological remediation. I think that's going to be a really big industry, unfortunately, in Ukraine. I think that will be a good thing ultimately, because it's something that we have to remediate all soils, even if they've just practiced agriculture. But if we need to understand the nature of the pollution before we can look at the solutions that there might be. I know I worked in Vietnam for 3 years in the 2000s, and there are still landscapes in Vietnam today which are still polluted from the American War of the 1960s and 70s. So, 40 years later, 50 years later, those landscapes are still deeply affected by the pollution that came from that war. Some of that is from munitions, some of that is from chemical warfare as well. So yeah, we do need to understand the issues. One thing I would say that's probably hopeful is that is the role of fungi. And because fungi or fungus there's more species of fungi than any other species of any other kingdom of nature. Their role in remediation work is only starting to become understood. The work of people like Paul Stamets and Peter McElroy, McCoy, I should say, in the United States, and then others around the world in understanding the role of fungi in remediation work is quite outstanding. But there's a lot to be done. So I would anticipate that agricultural and life sciences institutes and universities in Ukraine would have a very strong role to play in liaising with the body of international knowledge around that. One final thing to say on this is that the best way that we found, broad, and this is a very broad answer, the best way that we've found to deal with a soil pollution issue is to attack it with biological diversity. Attack the system, infect the system with as much biological diversity from as many of the kingdoms of nature as possible. Lynn Margulis and Carleen Schwartz years ago came out with a book called The Five Kingdoms of Nature. And within that, they came out with some principles. And one of those principles is that whatever is the toxin of one organism, so whatever is the toxin of us or the animals and crops that we consume, will be a nutrient to another organism from another kingdom. So it's a matter of matching. We're finding out more and more every day about fungi that eat plastics, about bacteria that eat this and that, and so on. So the whole biological remediation space is a really important one, and I think it will become obviously important for the restoration of Ukraine, but it was already important for the restoration of the world, because the world is a polluted place.